We're back. The second panel of the day is on allies responding to gray zone attacks. So first panel was on the legalities of it. The idea of this panel is to learn from what our allies are doing, because they're facing the exact same kind of problems we are. And to moderate this panel, we have Rachel Babins. She works in the private sector. She is one of the leaders of a new organization called Emerging Leaders in Canadian Security. They just launched their website. It's an organization. You can tell us more about your organization, but I'll just say that it fills a desperately needed niche, trying to provide an opportunity for emerging and medium rank people in all the different sectors of the Canadian defense and security community, particularly in the private sector, trying to build connections, try to provide mentoring. The CDSN just welcomed them in as a partner of our network, and we're looking to great things from them. So, Rachel, I'll leave you to the moderating of this panel, and thank you very much for participating today.
Thanks so much, Steve. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second panel titled Allied Responses to Gray Attacks at the Year Ahead Conference. These past few years have really challenged decision makers across the world, both in the private and public sector, as our adversaries have accelerated their use of different hybrid warfare mechanisms, experimenting with a variety of tools, techniques, and tactics. Of all the cyber attacks of 2021, the breach of Colonial Pipeline, the largest fuel pipeline in the United States, was reportedly one of the highest media attention breaches that we've seen. This attack led to shortages across the east coast of the United States, causing chaos and panic for many. Interestingly, the attack didn't actually impact the physical process for gas distribution, but targeted mainly administrative systems. It was a company decision to turn off the pipelines out of caution. Also, the threat actors later claimed that they simply didn't know that attacking a pipeline would cause such a large disruption. And they said in an almost apologetic statement following the attack, quote, "We are apolitical. Our goal is to make money and not, quote, creating problems for society." Even more curious was the group's reaction following FBI, quote, work on the issue, as they announced that they were shutting down because of the unspecified pressure from the United States. I could go on about this attack, but what strikes me is the large outcome of what was actually a minor intrusion to an administrative system caused by a weak password, as well as the clear politics at play between the US, Russia, and this quote-unquote apolitical group following the attack. This discussion our panel is about to have is certainly timely, and I look forward to hearing our panelists' remarks on a variety of these topics. With that said, I'd like to introduce our speakers, which hail from all over the world to discuss these important topics. First, we have Dr. Bastian Giegerich. Dr. Giegerich is the Director of the Defense and Military Analysis at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where he leads the research team that produces the IISS annual flagship publication, The Military Balance, oversees the development of the Military Balance Plus online database, and contributes to research and consultancy work. From 2010 to 2015, Dr. Giegerich worked for the German Federal Ministry of Defense in research and policy roles, while also serving as the IISS Consulting Senior Fellow for European Security. He holds a master's degree in political science from the University of Potsdam and a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. He's the author of several books on European security and defense matters, most recently with the Maximilian Terhale, The Responsibility to Defend Rethinking Germany's Strategic Culture. I'll first turn it to Dr. Giegerich to start with some remarks.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to share some thoughts with you today, this morning or afternoon here in the UK where I am. Rachel's introduction reminded me that I was working in government when the German government started to grapple with what was then called hybrid warfare and the idea that there is this space that I suppose we now call the gray zone, that sits somewhere between peace and conflict, or peace and war at least. So what I want to do today, I want to say a few words about the country I'm from, Germany, and the country in which I live and work, the United Kingdom, and then conclude with a few thoughts on actually a related aspect, namely the resilience conversation in Europe, and I'll weave in some thoughts on what this might mean for Canada and indeed for other allies. I think, as Steve earlier said a few minutes ago, actually a lot of this is or are problems that we obviously share. So I'll speak for, I don't know, eight minutes or so to just kick off, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Both the UK and Germany have, of course, recent experience of gray zone activities. In the UK, that focal point was perhaps that attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal. In the UK, it was also a very lively debate on Huawei as an instrument of Chinese state power and what that might mean for national infrastructure around telecommunications and 5G, later on 6G in particular. And it was just a reminder of the multifarious forms of state activity in that area, in that space between war and peace. And in Germany, alleged Russian agents conducted an assassination. We had cyber attacks on parliament and other government entities that were traced back to Russian sources, and Russian and Chinese influence networks are quite active, targeting public opinion and particular political fringes, or the fringes of the political spectrum, and trying to kind of tear at the seams of societal cohesion in Germany. The UK, as most of you will know, conducted a foreign security and defense policy review, the so-called integrated review, the results of which were published earlier this year, and it is now working on a national resilience strategy. There's a fairly active debate in government, in think tanks, in the wider community. Some of it is infrastructure focused, going back to the introduction that we just heard, but a lot of it sits in the wider context of resilience at home and abroad, which is one of the main themes in dealing with gray zone challenges in the UK and in Germany. And it's interesting that that resilience theme in the UK comes through not just where you would expect it in the National Resilience Strategy work or the preparatory work for that, but also in the recently completed Reserve Forces Review, in the National Infrastructure Commission, and in a lot of think tank work, and it all comes along several headers that have to do with responsibilities and accountability, with partnerships, with the investments required, and with what resilience actually means in the context of gray zone threats. In Germany, there's some early work on a resilience strategy, but the whole thought process is very heavily focused on civil preparedness and disaster response, so a pretty clear difference. Germany does have a conversation that links resilience with gray zone threats and with defense policy more broadly, but that conversation is, I would argue at least, rather incomplete and underdeveloped. And in the UK, on the other hand, resilience is an established element of thinking on modern deterrence and on efforts of reframing defense as or framing defense in part at least as a whole of society task. Now in the UK, that is not taking the form of what some of you might know as a total defense approach that some might know from Northern Europe, from some Scandinavian countries, but it does link much more directly to non-military threats emanating from opponents, including Russia, than it does in Germany. So the overarching framework in terms of gray zone and resilience for Germany seems to be civil preparedness, consequence management, disaster response, whereas in the UK, it is one of homeland defense and deterrence. And some of the challenges that Germany and the UK face in pursuing this approach and dealing with gray zone issues, I think I would argue are fairly universal, and there's probably of relevance to Canada. There's, on the one hand, there's a challenge of coordinating and creating frameworks for coherent action of a large number of actors. You have the multinational level, you have the national level, you have the subnational level, and you have the private sector, and making that work is very difficult and time-consuming, but increasingly also unavoidable. And the irony is perhaps that despite everybody agreeing that that is necessary, leading or creating an effective response will primarily be seen as a national level task. So the overall responsibility and accountability burden, so to speak, politically sits with national leaders who therefore should have a clear interest in making a whole of society approach work, at least in those European countries that I mentioned. In times of national emergencies, and the pandemic is the obvious example, recent example, there will be competition for scarce resources because there will be a demand surge. We have seen that across Europe and most of our countries. So if we think in terms of homeland security, pre-positioned assets, earmarked financial resources, all of those are instruments that people are looking to help mitigate the risk and in particular increase the robustness of the system, robustness rather than the redundancy of systems on a national level. Perhaps a word on technology. I think there's a trade-off that we need to talk about between using technology to optimize and generate efficiency on the one hand, and accepting rising interdependencies and the possibility of cascading the effects of disruption on the other. I think there's an interesting relationship between the ever-increasing level of interconnectivity on the one hand and the decreasing level of acceptable societal disruption on the other hand. That means that the role of technology creates on the one hand create resilience, but on the other hand also challenge it, and how to calibrate that, I think, is an interesting conversation that is a bit different in different national contexts, but I think it's one that we all might want to have. So I think for all of us, this implies that ultimately dealing with gray zone challenges through instruments of resilience or approaches of resilience really leads you to a risk management mindset that accepts that vulnerabilities will persist. It is not something where security is just a state that you achieve, and recovering from shock, restoring the ability to operate, and I mean here militarily, but also governmental, business, society. That seems to be the paramount goal. In NATO rhetoric, resilience is the first line of defense. A resilient system will deny at least some of the presumed benefits of an attack to the attacker. So therefore, there's a deterrence dimension to resilience, including in the gray zone. I think from a military perspective, which is obviously what I normally focus on, NATO allies need to talk about, and in fact they have started this conversation now, what capability requirements does the concept of resilience and meeting the gray zone challenge actually entail, and what planning parameters should be applied to this. So in other words, what are the practical implications of this for force sizes, for readiness, for capabilities, for equipment across that continuum from peace, crisis, conflict, war, and likewise, what civilian capacity and capabilities might need to be leveraged in that whole of society logic. So just to conclude, perhaps a few thoughts. I think what should be obvious to all of us now is that we live in an environment of near permanent and near constant contestation, and that contestation takes place not just in crisis spots and spots of tension, fragility, and conflict around the world, but it takes now place inside of our societies, of our own societies, within our own political institutions and political systems. And I think what Germany, the UK, and Canada share is that we have become the object of the foreign and security policies of other people. And that's not something that we're used to. That's actually, usually it's the other way around. We think, we think about projecting our our influence into other systems. And I think the fact that we're not used to it is part of the reason why the gray zone challenge is so disorienting to a lot of actors. So let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Back to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giegerich. You know, what you said about us being, you know, Germany, the UK, Canada, et cetera, you know, becoming the product of what others, the foreign policy of other states, very interesting. And I hope that we can sort of delve more deeply into that in the discussion following. I'm going to now turn to Dr. Marina Miran. Dr. Marina Miran holds a postdoctoral researcher position at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Currently, she is working on several projects, including the use of emerging technologies, most notably drones, in military and civilian contexts, and the use of the cyber domain as part of information warfare with a special focus on Russia. Dr. Miron is also a member of the King's College London Centre for Military Ethics, where she works on military ethics and military medical ethics related projects, most notably on the delivery of military ethics education to the Colombian Armed Forces. She is also an honorary researcher in military science at the Colombian War College and has participated in a number of international conferences, given lectures on topics to audiences all the way from the British Ministry of Defense to the NATO Center of Excellence, Defense Against Terrorism, on topics such as contemporary warfare, counterterrorism, and information warfare. So with that, I'll turn it to Dr. Miron to give some remarks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here again. It's a very important topic that we're discussing today, gray zone warfare. And one remark I would like to make, it's very interesting how the terminology has changed over the years. It used to be sub-threshold warfare, and to name one example, for instance, gray zone warfare is a phrase that is rarely used in official UK documents. For instance, the term appears only once in the UK's seminal Defence in a Competitive Age of 2021, and not at all in the MOD's integrated operating concept. So that poses a question, how seriously do we take the threat? What is our understanding of the threat of gray zone warfare? And what is it anyway? Because I see that a lot of focus is mostly on information warfare. So basically, just to say, gray zone warfare deals with actions that would preclude the alliance, NATO, from invoking Article 5. So it creates a legal constraint for the Western countries to respond to the likes of Russia and China. And of course, what is important to understand here is that, so I will be focusing more on the information spectrum and cyber spectrum, that gray zone warfare does not necessarily has to be about soft power. And we have seen this from the recent ASAT tests conducted by Russia. What was the response to that? What can we respond to that? It was not a kinetic attack on any country, correct? However, it raises a lot of concerns, specifically for the US, not just because of the debris that was caused by destroying that old satellite in the low Earth orbit, but about the potential capabilities of disrupt US operations in outer space. And the same goes for China. So while we are focused on information and disinformation, other very important activities take place, and we are unprepared to face them. We are unprepared to formulate an efficient response. And I will be touching upon UK's response to Russia's cyber operations to build on what Dr. Giegerich has already told us. What are the options? What can we do about it? So when we're talking about Russia and Russia's information warfare, in 2013, everybody was shocked about Gerasimov's doctrine and hybrid warfare. Interestingly enough, Russian sources attribute the term to Frank Hoffman, and that was his invention. As a matter of fact, Russian academics demonstrate that in Russia, nobody has searched for the term until about 2010, when they read that term in US publications. Essentially, what Gerasimov was saying is nothing new. If one comes from the background of strategic studies, what tools belong to a state? What does a state have in its toolbox? And we are perhaps familiar with the acronym DIME, that is diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, right? If we apply that paradigm to what Gerasimov was saying, we can see that all of these tools of statecraft are included. And if we use that same paradigm to analyze both China's and Russia's actions, and to a lesser degree, of course, Iran's actions, but I'm not an expert on Iran per se, so I will focus on those areas of my expertise, we can see that what essentially Russia and China are doing, they're trying to exploit the weaknesses of Western adversaries, because indeed they perceive them as adversaries across those four tools. Russia understands that militarily it is inferior to NATO forces. China's military is also not efficient. When was the last time China fought a contemporary war? China was a sponsor of several parties during the war in Syria. Russia has benefited from the Syrian war to gain experience, to rotate personnel in order to learn from this new contemporary battlefield what can be done, what should be done, how does it work after the emotional scars that the Soviet Union had from the war in Afghanistan in '79. So now, of course, Russia is claiming that militarily, and that's information to be consumed by the domestic constituency, that Russia has the strongest military in the world. However, Russia understands very well that it cannot risk a hot war with the West. What does it mean? Russia will try to exploit other avenues in order to degrade the capabilities of NATO countries and other countries that it sees as a threat to its internal security, in order to achieve that zero-sum game. In essence, because of the sanctions, because of Russia's economy, it cannot become stronger. It cannot be on par with, let's say, the United States. So the other way is to degrade them. If the contingent of the United States and the allied forces in Syria has the newest CMC systems, and Russia will have some jamming systems. And as a matter of fact, electronic warfare has been very prominent during the Syrian campaign, and that was something emphasized by the US, stating that now they need to adapt to this new challenge. So going back to information warfare, that is something that we academics call a sticky path. That has existed during the Soviet times, and the Soviet Union was very skilled in propaganda. And as a matter of fact, there are writings from the likes of Evgeny Messner, who wrote in the 50s, after the Second World War, that we are now leading the Third World War, and that is a war of consciousness. So the idea is to create an alternative reality. For Moscow, it doesn't necessarily mean just its own society, and we have seen Putin's efforts to strengthen that social cohesion that seems to be disintegrating in the West. And that's one of the centers of gravity identified by Russia. What can be exploited in the West? if military is no match for Russian forces, then the aim is to undermine the liberal democracy, undermine this idea, to sow doubt in the minds of the populations, both in the European Union, in the United States, in Canada, by creating disinformation campaigns, which again have been facilitated by cyberspace. Now, that makes things very complicated, because now we all are on social platforms, we're all on Facebook, we're all on Twitter. How do we know that the information we read is real? To quote Donald Rumsfeld, there are known knowns, there are unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. And so from this perspective, we are now in unknown unknowns. There is zero trust. And interestingly enough, the aim of Moscow is not just to make the populations abroad distrust their own governments. And perhaps it would be logical to make them favor Russia. No, it's absolute, complete distrust towards everything and everybody, which is a kind of an interesting path to go, with an ultimate aim, and that is actually a phrase used in the new military doctrine, is to exploit the protest potential of the population. So in this case, the population that is manned is not Russia's population, that is the population abroad. And we see all the political tensions. We see Russia's attempts to influence elections in France, in the United States. We see Russia conducting cyber operations, which are not to be classified as cyber attacks, do that later, such as SolarWinds, for instance. With an exception of Ukraine in 2015, all cyber operations conducted by GU, which formerly GRU, will be known in the literature as GRU. That term is no longer used. They are more about looking for weak spots in the system. And what is a system? Now let's think about how Europe releases data and about the whole transparency. So we have an issue. On the one hand, we have freedom, we have transparency. All the data is out there, open source. On the other hand, actors such as Russia, China, and Iran can exploit this data, and not just to influence popular opinion abroad, but also for planning military operations and the like. And so we have to think about what is more important in terms of response, whether securing that data would make more sense, thereby limiting this transparency, or risking data misuse. Because internet is not regulated. And now I'm coming to the last part. I hope I'm not over the time yet. What options do we have to respond specifically to Russia's information campaign, right? If we look at Cambridge Analytica and the links to Brexit, we're thinking, as a civilian, you're thinking they are doing all the same. Both Russia is engaging in information operations, so are our governments, and there are certain structures are being lied to. So there is a degree of doubt being created. The whole idea of democracy, and that has become evident with the COVID pandemic, has been undermined when countries like Spain and Italy restricted their citizens from going outside. And I happened to be in Spain during that time, and it was, nobody would believe that we're living in a liberal democracy. And every country, and that shows the weakness of the alliance and the weakness of the resilience, because when we're looking for solutions, we're looking for the lowest common denominator. ISAF mission to Afghanistan would be one example thereof. And so when it comes to responding to disinformation, to responding to cyber attacks, there are two options. Denial by punishment, deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. Now, deterrence by punishment would effectively mean that a country like the UK would have to use proportionally some sort of offensive cyber weapons. Now, can it? It would violate international laws of war, correct? So it would, again, play into Russia's hands to say, you are not abiding by your own laws. And deterrence by denial, how do you deter an actor like Russia or China? Because we are trying to use a bit of mirror imaging. The CIA was accused of doing that during the Cold War because they said, if we do A, the Soviet Union will do B. But we cannot apply that same logic here, and we have to understand what the aims, what the political aims are, what the strategic aims are, what the means and capabilities are that both Russia and China are using in order to be able to formulate a coherent and effective strategy that is not only feasible, but also acceptable to all parties and complies with international laws of war. So if the UK were to say, if you attack us, we will respond in kind, that will not be credible. And Russia knows it. So we have that problem. Of course, we can say that we will upgrade our IT infrastructure, we will ban imports from China, and so on and so forth. However, it's a reaction. What is needed is an action. So in a sense, Russia and China, when talking about the gray zone, will always be a step ahead, because on the one hand, we have very complex bureaucracies. We cannot reach an agreement on how to deal with certain things. Laws, international laws, take decades to be passed when there is an agreement on such a law. That's why cyberspace is still unregulated and there are many questions. Russia has already decided to create its RUNET and just disconnect itself just to protect its citizens from what it calls Western disinformation, which is trying, according to Russia, Soviet language again, to undermine Russia from the inside, right? Can Western states do that? Would that be democratic, or would that be legal in any way? And those are the questions we probably should be asking ourselves, because as it stands right now, Russia's favorite game, chess, we are in a stalemate. We haven't lost, but we are out of options in terms of how we can efficiently respond. So what my main point is that there needs to be some kind of a forum where such response is formulated, where such threats are better analyzed, rather than going after one strand or another. They should be seen as a complete integrated strategy, rather than mere information warfare, cyber warfare. And so we are trying to create different solutions for different problems. At the same time, we get distracted from other events on the ground. We get distracted from Syria, we get distracted from the Ukraine, we get distracted the strategic shadow play in Crimea. What happened? Why didn't anybody respond to that, right? So that is what needed of Western countries. I think not only the NATO alliance, we are talking about all countries, including Canada, on how to formulate a response, because we're in a majority. We have better capabilities. We just have to find legal ways of how they can be better utilized to deal with such threats. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miran. That was very interesting and a really good overview and analysis of the Russian case specifically, which, as we know in this, hybrid warfare discussion, disinformation discussion, they're definitely top of the list in terms of experts in that, area. I found what you were saying really interesting, and I think that this is something that we should come back to in the discussion, especially on, your point about these unknown unknowns, and how do we really deter by punishment when we're not fully, aware of, we're not fully analyzing the threats that are coming at us and responding in kind. So definitely something that we'll come back to. And, in comparison to what Dr. Giegerich was saying about more of a spectrum look of resiliency and, looking at Germany versus the UK. So something that we'll definitely return to. Before we go to our discussion, we're going to hear from our final speaker, we'll hear from Michael J. Mazarr. Michael Mazarr is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Previously, he worked at the U.S. National War College, where he was a professor and associate dean of academics as president of the Henry L. Stimson Center, senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, senior defense aide on Capitol Hill, and as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His primary interests are U.S. defense policy and force structure, disinformation and information manipulation, East Asian security, nuclear weapons and deterrence, and judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. Definitely relevant for this discussion. Mazarr holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Maryland. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Very good to be here, if only virtually. Really, it's unfortunate that wasn't able to join you in person, but it's great to talk about these issues. Anyway, I wanted to talk about this from the U.S. perspective, sort of given a sense of where I see the discussion on this general issue of the gray zone in the U.S. now, and with some implications for allies. And my basic argument is that I feel like we're approaching an inflection point in the discussion of this, in terms of the semantics of it, but also the substance, heading into what we might call gray zone 2.0, except that I think that term is going to become significantly less common over the next few years for a variety of reasons. So what I thought I'd do is give a few reasons why I think we're approaching a change, sort of a phase change in how we're thinking about this, and then a few ideas of what the emerging version of this issue looks like. So one reason I think that we're approaching an inflection point is that we've really started to disaggregate this problem. It's useful to think about the gray zone, competition below the threshold of war, but I think increasingly, as we have put more emphasis into understanding a variety of these tools, what we're discovering or reminding ourselves is that there's very significant differences among these. There are some that are much easier to deter and some that we really just have to compete with. Lumping targeted assassination of individuals, as in the Skripal poisoning, with kind of economic coercion is really putting instruments together that have vastly different standing under international law or the nature of competition. And in a variety of ways, I think it's just, we're starting to pull this issue apart a little bit and think about discrete issues. And as the comments from not just the two preceding panelists here, but also the prior panel, I think, make clear, cyber and informational aspects of this are, as I'll emphasize, becoming increasingly significant, if not dominant. Even within that realm, there is very significant differences among the kinds of challenges that we're facing. So one thing I think that's happening is that what we have been referring to as the gray zone is kind of fragmenting a little bit into a focus on a variety of very different policy problems. Second, I think we're approaching kind of a new era in thinking about this, because China and Russia have been producing increasingly decisive reactions and responses to their actions. When we first thought about this at RAND 5 or 6 years ago, one of the things that we immediately thought was, this stuff is not a magic wand. To the degree that Russia and China are interfering in the domestic security of other countries or coercing others, they are going to produce reactions, and that's exactly what's happened. And a lot of the discussion so far has really been, I think, tilted toward Russia. But obviously Canada is an Asian country in the same way the United States is, and China's increasing profile in this area is an aspect of concern for all of us. So if you look at China's actions in the South China Sea, China's actions with their wolf warrior diplomacy, Russia's actions in terms of disinformation or the targeted assassinations, all of those have generated a very significant response. And so now we're in a position where China, for example, has really destroyed its kind of public persona in countries like South Korea, even the Philippines, certainly Japan. You've now seen comment or statements from Japan, the Japanese government and former Japanese leaders on things like its commitment to regional responses to Chinese coercion, its potential responses to a Taiwan contingencies that frankly we wouldn't have imagined 4 or 5 years ago. So in a variety of these areas, these gray zone campaigns are generating very powerful responses that I think have turned the strategic landscape against Russia and China in very significant ways. That leads to my third point of why we're kind of approaching an inflection point, and that is that the strategic balance is not shifting against the West. I think a lot of the discussion of the gray zone early on talked about how these were the kinds of tools that we couldn't match, and they were going to allow China and Russia to win the strategic competition. In my view, that's not happening at all. If anything, Russia and China broadly and strategically are in a worse position than they were 5 years ago, in part because of the reactions that they're generating with these kind of tools. If you look at things like the alignment of major powers and where does Japan fall? South Korea, India, Brazil, Mexico, the EU in general. I mean, if you look at a number of EU states recently hosted Taiwanese representatives for visits and sort of courted Chinese reaction with that, you're seeing a lot of steps where countries all around the world are kind of stepping up, primarily democracies, but not only democracies. Vietnam, I would put in this category, are stepping up, and China and Russia are not in any way promoting a better alignment of general international power in their favor. If you look at particular indicators, which we did of sort of, for example, in Asia, are countries agreeing to Chinese demands in terms of territorial issues, in terms of ignoring the 2016 Hague ruling on territorial disputes? Is China beginning to get countries to agree to limit participation in U.S. military exercises or alliances? The answer to all those questions is no, that we're not seeing significant movement in their direction. Countries are definitely trying to hedge, but we're not seeing great success for the countries employing these. And then fourth and finally, the U.S. government has, in the conceptual realm, not necessarily in the policy response realm, really begun to formalize some of its thinking about this. You see things like the Joint Concept for Integrated Campaigning. Both the Army and the Marine Corps have published doctrinal statements about competition. There are other doctrinal approaches in the works. And I think in the forthcoming National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, you're going to see mentions of these issues. The Defense Department is actively trying to come to grips with this problem of competition below the threshold of armed conflict. So for all these reasons, I think that the discussion we started with in 2014, 2015 about the gray zone now needs to advance to a kind of a new realm. And what would that look like? A few clues very briefly that I would see. One is information is the linchpin. So Marina mentioned the Russian notion of the war of consciousness, and that general idea that a competition over information, narratives, information security, all of the things in the information operations basket, both internationally and also protecting our own domestic environment, as really the centerpiece of the ongoing competition below the threshold of war, and then which would be the centerpiece of the competition in war, is I think really has risen to the surface. Now the challenge here is our work on this has convinced me that, frankly, it is very difficult to quantify the effect that Russia, for example, has had with its disinformation campaigns. And I see this problem of the war of consciousness as being 95% domestic. It is what we're doing to ourselves that is primarily the problem. And Russia and now increasingly China try to piggyback on that, and they can have little discrete anecdotal success stories. But I don't see this as a problem primarily of one where external actors are having great success in moving the needle in these areas in terms of lack of trust, lack of faith in institutions, whatever. These are things that are happening within Western societies. And that makes the response, in fact, much more complicated. But information as a leading edge issue, Secondly, organizing for response. Within the US government, we are still not organized, whole of government, across government, cross-domain, multi-domain, whatever we call it, linking the various elements of the US government, not even, before we get to the discussion of linking public and private. Because in the information realm, of course, as we know, if you want to ask the question of who has the data we need and who controls the networks and understands what's going on in the information networks, it's 95% private actors. But the linkages between public and private to really respond to this are in their infancy. So that, maturing that is an obvious priority for this new era of response. A third aspect of this, or another aspect of that which was brought up earlier, was the intelligence piece. So in the US intelligence response to this, it's advancing a bit, but it really raises this perennial intelligence problem of open source intelligence and the balance between secrets and open information. And in responding to these kinds of threats, open source information really is the dominant kind, but the intelligence community, I think, is still struggling to keep up with that. Third piece of the emerging understanding of this is the building of norms. This came up, I think, in the prior panel, the reference to the UN, GGE, and other kinds of information security norms. How can we build normative constraints on these kinds of actions in addition to building domestic resilience and so on? Fourth, as we continue to understand this, I think pushing back against these kind of threats doesn't mean ignoring our rivals' national interests. And this has been mentioned a couple of times. In the information realm, for example, Russia's answer is, you guys talk about our interference in your domestic processes all the time, yet you claim the ability to promote democracy in ways that interfere in our political processes, as far as we're concerned. And the United States and our democratic allies have not resolved that issue. And I think figuring out how to balance those questions of defending ourselves and establishing norms while preserving the right, particularly of non-governmental actors, to take actions that promote democracy without creating a completely hypocritical standard where we say, we can do to you what we are demanding you not do to us, that's going to be a big challenge. And the final thing I would say is the biggest lesson in the last several years to me is that the issue of the gray zone, below the threshold competition, is really a transitional concept on the way to an understanding of this broader reality that's been the subject of a lot of discussion, a number of books, which is the nature of conflict is changing, and the focus of conflict is increasingly the stability and security of rival homelands. That tends to blur the boundary between peace and war. But even in wartime, the security of American sort of information networks, logistical networks, all of that sort of stuff, but more broadly, this idea that, as I've argued, that we need to advance to what we might call a virtual territorial integrity norm. I think we've made some progress in establishing a general territorial integrity norm so that large-scale violations of sovereignty are now seen as unacceptable in the international community. We don't always respond entirely decisively, as 2014 and Ukraine proved, but at least the norm is reasonably well established. What's happening now is that attacks and conflict are migrating into spaces that are not covered by that norm. And our big priority for the future is establishing this new norm. But the challenge that I see is, as I mentioned, the most significant and fundamental threats to societal stability are not coming from outside, they are coming from inside. And so this creates this incredibly messy new realm in which the very concept of national security is going to mean new things. And the steps that we have to take to preserve the goals we establish in national security documents will have as much to do with how we are managing domestic issues like inequality, like bias and managing the implications of diversity, all those kinds of things. That's all going to become kind of mixed together. And the US government, at least, is a long way away from the kind of thoroughly integrated discussions that we will need to manage that kind of new era. So that's where I see that we're at from a US perspective.
Thank you so much, Michael. And your view that, this is an issue not only for, in the foreign policy space, but mostly in the, I guess, domestic policy space is very interesting. I think this actually leads to the first question that I wanted to ask the panel. We here at this conference are lucky to have people from all different segments within the security and defense space, whether it's on the academic side or on the practitioner side, whether it be in the policy space, military space, and as well as people from the private sector. So I'm curious, you all spoke about different ways that we can different sort of frameworks for resiliency and how different cases and countries are potentially responding. If you were advising somebody either at the strategic, operational, or tactical level, in a very clear, this is how I would sort of advise you to respond to the current threat environment as we're seeing it, what sort of advice would you give to that country? And I know that's a bit of a loaded and hard question to answer, but I want to, it would be great to have something that we could sort of take away from this panel and really potentially think to implement into policies or other things that, as this space is constantly changing and adapting. So with that, I'll turn it back to the group. So Bastian, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Thanks for that easy question. Look, I mean, well, first of all, let me quickly say something on Mike's very good points. I mean, I think the one thing that we might just make sure that we get right is, Mike, as you said, it's our domestic vulnerabilities that are the problem, but they are, of course, domestic vulnerabilities that are being exploited, that are being exploited by others. So I think I would just be careful that we don't go so far to disconnect the external activities from those domestic vulnerabilities. I'm sure that's not what you meant, but I just would caution against that a little bit. At least in Europe, you can very clearly see that work, and I would argue that the US is not short of examples as well, where that connection was pretty clear. So, Rachel, on your question, I mean, I think the first thing I would say, if I were advising anybody who needs to make decisions on this, is that you have to accept that all of your choices will be suboptimal, because I think it isn't possible to be perfectly prepared for a number of reasons. And it's a classic, it's actually not new, it's a classic defense planning dilemma that you will not be able to afford to prepare for everything, and you will not be able to overly specialize on a small number of contingencies, because we have been in for surprises, and we will continue to be in for surprises. So that's the first reality that people need to accept. So in that sense, you're moving the conversation to a conversation about vulnerabilities, about managing risks, about mitigation, and I think once you move away from what we've been discussing, the gray zone, it is really about a balance, and it is about maintaining the ability to react to changing circumstances. I think that's at that abstract level that you asked the question, that's I think what I would say, and then everything else is a matter for what situation are we actually in. But I think we have, at least in Europe, it feels like our security environment has deteriorated, and the problem is we have some new risks and some new challenges, but the old ones have not gone away. So there are more vectors. The attack surface is perhaps broader than we previously understood. So there isn't the new replacing the old. It is about dealing with the new and the old in parallel and simultaneously, and I think that's what makes these choices so difficult.
Thank you. And if I could follow up on that answer, you spoke a lot about, vulnerabilities and specifically the need to approach this from a risk-based approach. What are some of those vulnerabilities specifically that you would address first, or you would advise to address first?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about European countries, I mean, let's you would need to make it a bit specific. So let's take China, for example. I think we can have a very informed conversation now in Europe about China and around government positions and strategic competition and competition below the threshold and all of these kinds of things. But the reality is a lot of our, if you take the German case, if you speak to our car makers, they will say we sell more cars in China in I don't know 2 weeks, 3 weeks than we do in a year in India. So why would we engage in some of this diversification that you're talking to us about? So if you talk about a vulnerability like that, where our economic activity supports the development of capacity and capability in China, one needs to ultimately get to that point where one asks, well, is that actually in our interest to do? And that, I think, creates the difficult choices where our economic success fuels the future problem, and we need to find ways to get, just to make, use a specific example, to get government, therefore, to set parameters that the private sector can, diversify into as the German government keeps saying, a China plus X approach to its activities. But it is actually really difficult. Those are the kinds of deeper vulnerabilities that are below what we see in the headlines and that I think are very hard to address. Now, others have spoken very eloquently about cyber and information. Again, I think that's another area. But if I may, just for 10 seconds, bring it back to military matters, I think what European countries are only slowly beginning to understand is that while some of them think of themselves as the rear area in any conflict, they haven't quite understood that the rear area is where some of the battle will take place because of, if you just think about the combination of long-range precision strike matched with cyber attacks, matched with disinformation campaigns, all of that will happen in the rear area. So those are vulnerabilities, again, that in capability terms, we need to address. The list is actually very long, Rachel, but let me just make a start and then hand it over to others.
Thank you for that. All right, we'll move on to Dr. Miron. Did you have either an answer or wanted to follow up on what the other speakers have discussed?
Thank you very much, Rachel. I would just like to briefly follow up. The question is abstract enough, but generally speaking, what is important is not only to understand your own capabilities and how far you're willing to go with your response and how you're going to allocate them. As an example, again, with the UK responding to Russia's alleged cyber attacks, because again, this is a problem of attribution in order to respond. So you have strategic communication, or you would do it as the US did, very interestingly, probing an electric grid in Russia, as in saying, you dare, we will take it out, right? Whether it's legal or not, but it's up to each actor how far they are willing to go and what the potential trade-offs are. Again, are we interested in a conflict, let's say with China, if we know that we're importing aluminum from China? What is going to happen to aluminum prices in 2022? And that will affect, amongst others, the steel industry in Europe, particularly in Germany. Another one would be rare earth minerals. Again, China. Do we really want to have a confrontation with China, Russia? Again, energy. They're using different tools from that dime toolbox to a distinct degree. So the problems that we are facing are so multifaceted. If we try to counter one problem, we're essentially aggravating another problem. So there has to be careful consideration in terms of how far we're willing to go. France's approach to Russian cyber is to open a dialogue with Russia on cyber. Now, how credible that is in terms of them cooperating on that one matter, and that has been going since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. However, there has been cooperation, but at least keeping the enemy close, you kind of get the idea of, or at least a little glimpse of what is going on, right? So it will be up to every single actor. Now, the biggest problem is, can these actors reach some sort of a common ground? Again, US versus the UK approach, or the French approach versus the German approach. Now, are we acting as an alliance? Are we acting each of us for themselves according to the capabilities? And we shouldn't be looking for support of other countries if we take steps with which others not necessarily agreeing. So that makes the matter complicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And lastly, we'll turn it over to Michael.
So in answer to your question, I think there's one answer, which is just a very big and non-security theme about the vulnerabilities of countries being primarily a function of the institutions in the society being unable to solve problems, the levels of inequality and kind of alienation, things like that. So, but that's obviously not a security issue so much. In the security realm, I would say two things. One, to kind of the general US government, and one specifically to the military. To the general US government, we have got to find a way to organize our response to the increasingly integrated set of military and non-military issues in this realm. I mean, just to take cyber as an example, it's taken us years of struggle to get to trying to have a single office that is the unquestioned coordinator for cyber response policy in the United States government, prevention and response, and we're not even really there yet. We've got all these different nodes that coordinate better in that realm than in some others, but still not nearly well enough. The problem we have is we've got a Defense Department that looms over this whole situation with its size, and it has a planning history and tradition. But most of the issues are not strictly DoD issues. And what's going on these days is a lot of folks in defense saying, you know, we fight and win the nation's wars. Why are you asking us to solve the nation's problem short of war? You've got other departments and agencies like state that simply don't have the budget, the manpower, the planning traditions to be able to run large-scale campaigns of the kinds we're talking about. Other parts of government that just don't have a history of this at all. You've got the National Security Council that sits on top, but coordinating policy, not doing operations, and without, again, the personnel to be able to really take this over. So we've got to get somehow serious, and there's different ways of doing it, but we've got to get serious about this long-standing issue of whole of government coordination. And then for the military in particular, I'd say, looking to the future, the part of this that worries me the most is that we've had a decade now of discussion about our cyber vulnerabilities, and we're still not institutionally taking seriously the fact that 10 minutes into the next conflict with somebody, we're going to be looking around wondering what just happened. And I think we've got to put more effort, resources, attention to becoming the most information resilient military on the face of the earth. And we're crawling in the direction of that priority, but we're not there yet. So those are the two, you know, if I were, as you say, giving advice, those are two things that I'd really highlight.
Thank you so much. We now have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn to those. So the first question here is, how is Russia influencing elections in the US and France, and what tactics have they used? I'll open it up if there's anybody that would like to go first in answering.
Well, I can say a quick thing just to start. We've done some work on that and some RAND projects. I would distinguish two things. One is, big social media campaigns, right? Using the social media platforms to put out a lot of information in a lot of different ways, sometimes bot driven, sometimes, combination of bots and actual individuals. And then a separate technique, which is kind of leaking documents, and the infamous leaking through WikiLeaks of Hillary Clinton's emails and other US government documents designed to influence the outcome of election. There's been significant work done on that as well. I tend to see that as having potentially had a bigger effect on an actual American election than anything else. One of the things I was saying earlier was we've looked really hard for this, and I have yet to see persuasive evidence on the specific level of effect that Russian social media disinformation or misinformation or influence operations had on actual voting or other election outcomes in the United States. All the evidence I've seen is that the Russian activities, and I agree with Bastian, we can't ignore them, but in terms of measuring their effect, the numbers and size were pretty small relative to the overall numbers of social media tweets, posts, and so on going on in the United States. So I think this is more of a preview of what we're going to see in the future rather than so far a decisive kind of action. But those are some of the techniques that they've been using.
Thank you for that.
I think if I can just add a few thoughts to this. I mean, I think, in France, I mean, I'm not a specialist on France, but I think what we're seeing there has been similar, even though maybe on a different scale, with the Macron leaks back in a few years ago now. I can't remember which year it was, and social media-driven campaigns designed to polarize and to push people towards fringes and basically pull at the seams of those domestic vulnerabilities that Mike is talking about. I agree, it's very hard to measure how effective that is. It certainly does receive attention. I would say though that I think most of our countries are now better prepared to deal with that and to counter those kinds of campaigns. So I think we saw that in Germany in the elections last September, or in the run-up to the elections last September. I would venture a guess that we'll see that again now in the run-up to the French presidential election. So I think if the effect was hard to measure before, it'll probably get even harder to measure now because I think we're a bit better now in keeping an eye on those kinds of things.
Thank you. Dr. Miron, did you want to add anything?
I believe everything has already been said. What I wanted to say is, first of all, by what metrics do you measure the effect? There is no way you can operationalize any variables in terms of measuring an influence of Russia's information campaign. So most of it is based on what we're reading, open source information, and so on and so forth, and at this particular point, what Russia is looking for essentially is to exploit schisms within societies. The same was the case in Spain was a Catalan independence, where they were trying to actively worsen the situation and encourage the Catalan government to fight for independence from Spain. And I think we will be seeing it throughout. It will not be that evident. What is important is at what point are our societies when it comes pre-election? Are there two groups that are competing against each other? Is there a middle ground? How high are the tensions in these societies? And so I believe that Russia will be looking for these societies on the tipping point and will try to add just one light push to tip them over the edge. And that's what essentially Russia has been terming as exploiting the protest potential of the population, because after the whole COVID measures the populations of Europe became quite disillusioned with the politicians, with the government, with the democracy, and so on and so forth. Certainly, it was not Russia who did this. However, they can easily exploit those dissatisfactions with liberal democracy in order to create a conflict. And that's something that we should be aware of and should be taking measures against. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I see that we're at time here, so I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for this fascinating conversation and for your remarks. We really appreciate your attendance today, so thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent panel. It was reassuring, not in the least, as I worry that if the threat really is domestic, in terms of these things, we're not going to get much cooperation on it. I do appreciate the basic notion that the Russians and the Chinese have not only made us all worse off, but made themselves worse off. So at least international relations theory and the circular dilemma are still alive today, if that's the only thing we could take solace from all of this. But it does speak to the need for diplomacy, because ultimately the two panels together suggest that the best way to deal with these kinds of problems is to actually for us to stop pinging at each other, because the current endeavor is certainly not leading us into any place productive. So thanks again from Europe and from the United States. That was a really terrific panel, really thought-provoking. And thanks to Rachel, and good luck with the launching of